Welcome to our study, the Bodhisattva Guide, His Holiness the Dalai Lama's commentary on Shantideva's The Way of the Bodhisattva, one of the great classics of Buddhism, particularly Mahayana Buddhism. So as always, we would want to approach this study very much with the sense that we are addressing the core issue of suffering. And the core issue of suffering is not that there's somebody out there that did something bad, or that the world is just destined to be a difficult place, or that we're being punished for not knowing what to do, or something like that. The core issue here is a bewilderment that has taken place, and all sentient beings being bewildered perpetuate their own suffering despite wishing happiness, and actually continually operating from a place of wishing happiness, which reflects really the abiding innate intelligence that somehow knows happiness, well-being is the nature of reality, and yet due to this bewilderment and a particular way that we construct reality, which is where we think of our own person and we perceive this conscious dimension of luminous reality as it exists within a dimension of just presence, wakefulness, consciousness, mind, whatever we call it, first person subjectivity. Within that dimension, this is construed as being me. And that me then is basis for the perception of this luminosity in terms of the display as being perceived as other. And that's where we have this experience of self and other, I and the other. And in this situation, then the I struggles. The I thinks, I need this, and I feel good when I get this. I don't like that. I feel bad when this happens. And within that situation then of the I continually struggling with the phenomena or the display or experience, then there is an increasing solidification of this sense of I. And this, all sentient beings suffer from that. It's on the basis of this then that we have this self-centered toxicity that we refer to as the kleshas, or the conflicting emotions or afflictions, or we have many words for it, neurosis and so on. But on the basis of that, then acting in particular ways, we perpetuate patterns of action which we call karma. These actions, they imprint themselves in our basic confusion, what we call the alaya vijnana, or the storehouse consciousness. And this then becomes part of our identity. And it's on the basis of that we re-embody ourselves again and again in various forms, in various situations. In this life, we can see how we, if not exactly reinvent ourselves, then we certainly we're reborn again and again. And actually, we're not reinventing ourselves because there's not really that autonomy that is involved in reinvention, if you like. And even if we could reinvent ourselves, we would actually not have the insight to do so properly. And so there is a pattern of continually dragging along our luggage, our baggage from the past, in terms of just perpetuating our own habits, our own views, our own particular emotionality, and so on. And there's very little freedom in that. And this is what the Buddha saw. And this is also when we approach this study, it's very much that we are determined to get to the bottom of that, because this afflicts us, it afflicts everybody. There's an issue here that needs to be attended to. And so kindly then the Buddha taught, and we have then the teaching of the Buddha, which we are presently then studying, really with the awareness of this core condition of confusion that needs to be remedied. So we'll begin this study with, like His Holiness suggests, just some chants. Abandoning evil doing, practice virtue well, subdue your mind. This is the Buddha's teaching. Like a star, an optical illusion or a flame, a magical illusion, a dewdrop or a bubble, like a dream, a flash of lightning or a cloud, so should one consider all compounded things. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. So we've just begun the 4th chapter, the chapter on carefulness. And the first 3 chapters are very much about identifying bodhicitta, understanding the value of bodhicitta, and also making bodhicitta, taking ownership of bodhicitta through vowing to pursue this or engage in the path of the Bodhisattva. And last time, His Holiness was just going over the initial section then on the chapter of carefulness, and he's just going to select a few slokas from that chapter. The chapter itself is how many stanzas are there? So there are in the chapter of carefulness, there is 48, not so many actually, but there are 48, and we're just going to be looking at a few. And by the way, I hope all of you had the opportunity to attend the reading transmission yesterday. I sent a mail out to all of you who are on the mailing list. So this is something we should appreciate. It's not always, particularly in the modern world, that we have this opportunity to receive reading transmissions. And of course, so much of Buddhism we can't. It seems even the lineage teachers and so on, they have, how do you say, accepted this fact. But when we have the opportunity, it's really wonderful. And of course, with the reading transmission from Tugupen Wangel then, of the Bodhisattva, of the way of the Bodhisattva, we have actually a lineage that comes from Paltram Rinpoche and the first Jamgon Khyentse down through just a very few masters down to Tugupen Wangel. So I hope you could attend that. And if not, don't worry. There's many of us who have studied the way of the Bodhisattva without reading transmissions. And of course, the most important is really to apply ourselves to what is being taught. Anyway, His Holiness made a very important point at the beginning, and that is, as it says here, this mind of ours has the potential for accomplishing all the qualities of Buddhahood. So we're not stuck in a situation in which there are some great sublime teachers and we're destined to be small people and who are following, and to the best of our humble ability, just try, but it could never be done. That sort of despondency is not basic to what's being presented here. It is very much about we can do. And so also we're going to come across some very provocative perspectives. Some of the teachings in mind training and the Bodhisattva training are incredibly demanding. And so that's where there's never ever a sense that we're just being left alone to be little people who just can sort of tag along, sort of in the shadow of the great beings. But very much there is the sort of like, wake up, you can do it. So there's a lot of very provocative instructions in terms of basically trusting that we could abandon this poverty-stricken idea that, oh, I could never do this. So So of course we need to approach this in a very realistic way, and that's where His Holiness Sen says, but these qualities are temporarily obscured by our mistaken belief in the existence of an I, and by self-centeredness and negative emotions, the kleshas. These are the powerful enemies of the power of the positive attitude that we have generated. They live within our mind. They are not outside. And that's then where we then identify what is the issue. And we can use the word enemy, not in the sense of struggling against something external, but rather identifying that there's something within ourselves that we're not doing exactly quite right. And this is something that we shouldn't just say, oh, well, that's just how I am. And I'm kind of interesting having my own quirky sort of style of being, afflicted in this way. That just doesn't work. These are things that are cancerous. They are destructive. They are profoundly afflictive in terms of our happiness and the happiness of others. So that's where we presently then need to engage in this study of carefulness, because we have the instructions. It's more about us actually being sufficiently present and attentive so that we can apply these teachings, these instructions. So Shantideva then writes, and we're going to look at the first and the fourth stanza here, says, the children of the conqueror who thus have firmly grasped this bodhicitta should never turn aside from it, strive never to transgress its disciplines. And then it says, for if I bind myself with promises, but fail to carry out my word in deed, then every being will have been betrayed. What destiny must lie in store for me? So yeah, this is where there's a commitment we've made, and that commitment is great, and we probably feel good in committing ourselves to this, except it goes a bit further than just signing up. It also involves training. And so that's where there is discipline. It's not just like, oh yeah, I have my path, and I am a Buddhist, or I am a yogi, or I am whatever. I'm a student of so and so, and this becomes sort of credentials for us. We could probably actually just turn that down a bit and really focus on what really is involved with being students of so and so and being on the path, which is then abiding by our own discipline. And by the way, let's just be clear, I'm speaking to myself here. This is not intended on. I'm sure everybody is really applying ourselves to this, but Shantideva certainly very compassionately when it comes to myself. Then when I read this, it certainly rings a bell, and sort of an alarm bell rather. And that's where personally I find this incredibly helpful. There's definitely a recognition of the value of bodhicitta. There's also definitely a need for this thing that we can call striving, applying oneself. And then he also outlines where we could end up having tremendous regret. We might have committed ourselves to something great and wonderful, but if we fall short of actually walking the talk, then it's not just that we're harming ourselves in terms of having great, you could say, self-deception and cause of future regret, but also this is really an opportunity in which we could have done so much for others. So just keeping that in mind now, then there's a reason to not have regret later on. And that's where we consider then that I'm fooling myself and I'm also deceiving others. There's other sentient beings, those who have cared for me, or those who have been my parents, those who have been my children, and so on. All these beings, we're connected with them. So that's where it's not just about our own little private nirvana, it's very much about the community at large, the well-being of the community at large. So that if we fail to do so, then we'll actually be carrying the destiny, what may lie in store for me. That really implies that we would end up constructing ourselves in a very sad way. His Holiness says, this bodhicitta that we have generated has not been forced upon us. We have taken the bodhicitta vow voluntarily. We have taken it with all the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas as witnesses and for the sake of all beings. So to go against this vow is to show scant respect for the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. We have lied to them and betrayed all beings as well. This is a very serious failure. And of course, as again and again we point out in the Buddhist teaching, we're not theistic. It's not as if the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas are going to punish us. We understand Buddhas and Bodhisattvas as abiding within ourselves, as part of the luminosity of our own being. And yet, understanding them as present within us, as something that we presently fully haven't realized. We have Buddha nature, yet we haven't realized it. Then we identify this quality that we have in terms of the manifestation of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, and what we're doing with this presence of enlightenment as it abides within ourselves, and whether we think of it as abiding within or whether we visualize all the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas externally, these constitute the dimension of truth. So while we can choose to see them as external to us or internal, however we choose it, they embody truth. They are more true than our shifting conditions or the shifting conditions of us karmically constructed beings. And as us invoking this dimension of truth and taking them as our witness, then it is that we have a situation in which we're you could say accountable to the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, in the sense that we're accountable to ourselves. And so lying to them is, in some sense, yes, we could identify this as lying to someone, but it's also ultimately really a question of self-deception. And perhaps even more importantly, we've also engaged in a vision of benefiting others and wanting to do that, and yet falling short of it would be a very serious failure. So, His Holiness continued, we should therefore make every effort not to spoil our bodhicitta. We must devote all our energy to this purpose. Moreover, there is no knowing when death may overtake us. At this moment, we may be in good health, but life can end suddenly. Let us make the best use of our days, being careful all the time. It's a great mistake to be lax today, saying that we will be more strict tomorrow. We should try to discipline our minds constantly, so that we can become the good people we promised to be when we took the vow. This involves watching the mind persistently. So there's very much a spirit of can-do. There's absolutely no reason that we can't do this. This is not like must do this, but implicitly sort of there's this sort of double bind that you should be a good boy or girl, but then there's the sort of the unspoken, but I know you're not. I know you're rotten to the core. You're a bad person. You should improve yourself. That sort of scenario that we sometimes sort of encounter, and we so very often generate this in the arts and in the sort of the dramas that we have, both in our own life or sort of in the entertainment or in the arts of various kinds. And that's where we're in no way, the Buddha in no way is saying, you're destined to be incapable. There's very much the emphasis, there's no reason not to. But it is also there where there needs to be a serious shift. And we need to take into account how presently we have every opportunity. There will be times when we might not be able to work so freely and so constructively and have the clarity and the ability, and all of a sudden our life just could very easily cut short. So this happens. I was just talking to a friend yesterday who had some issue with his heart. He went to the hospital, and then all of a sudden he felt very unwell. And all of a sudden, like he described it, something greater than himself. And he just remembers sort of just sliding down in front of his hospital bed. And then he woke up quite a few hours later. And so he had a heart failure that lasted for, he said, about 6 seconds. His heart just stopped, and it started again. But as we have these encounters with our volatility, then this reflection of impermanence becomes less theoretical. And presently it is very often tainted by this condition of just the involvement with all the things that are going on in our life, and we think this is really so important and that is so important. But these are really just very superficial appearances that, of course, we need to deal with, but also they won't really, that we won't be here for very long. So that's where this is not sort of spelling doom and gloom, but it's really just about carpe diem and seizing the moment that we have right now. And that what we're then attending to is then the application of what's important, namely this discipline of watching the mind. So His Holiness says, all of us wish to be happy and do not want suffering. We do not need to be told this. But on one hand, we do not know what we should do or avoid in order to get what makes us happy. So that's on one hand. On the other hand, because our negative emotions are so strong, we engage in negative actions even though we can see what is wrong with them. It is the emotion that is the real enemy to each of us being a good person. So on one hand, there's just a general just confusion, just not being clear. We very often think, grabbing a bit of happiness, just a little bit of happiness, or maybe a big chunk of happiness, but just grabbing it really in an aggressive or ignorant way is just not really the way forward. And also very often we do engage in saying, I just can't help myself. This is just how I am. So the force behind that are then these kleshas, the enemies. Of course, if we received Vajrayana teachings, we would say, oh yes, but the arising of the kleshas, that's just the food for the Dharmakaya. This is transformed into the various kinds of wisdom and so forth. And that's true. If there's no duality involved, if we really have that realization that understands and realizes egolessness, yes, then there's never ever a moment that we stray from the presence of wakefulness. And in that case, whatever arises, it doesn't in any way constitute something that is toxic. But not having that, then we're struggling in this fog of our dualistic self-grasping. And that's where, or grasping itself another, and that's where then the energy of the mind is diminished into these toxic conditions of essentially just they're all harnessed really to the objective of self. And that's where we then have something that is destructive. So in the experience of an ordinary sentient beings, these constitute enemies. So that's where then Shantideva says, anger, lust, these enemies of mine are limbless and devoid of faculties. They have no bravery, no cleverness. How then have they reduced me to such slavery? They dwell within my mind, and at their pleasure injure me. All this I suffer meekly, unresenting. Thus my abject patience all displaced. O my enemy, afflictive passion, endless and beginningless companion, no enemy indeed is able to endure so long. Yesterday I happened on a quote from Dilgu Khyentse Rinpoche, which sort of also highlights this. So we describe this confusion, and particularly the constructs, and you could say the strategies, the insecurity, the basic misery of this condition of self. We describe this in terms of an ego because, as weak as it might be, as non-existent that it might be, it's something that we fail to actually confront and really, you could say, dismantle. So here's this is actually not from Dilgu Khyentse Rinpoche. Sorry, this is Shichen Rabchen Rinpoche. And it's in a commentary on Dilgu Khyentse Rinpoche's teacher, who wrote a text called The Great Medicine. And in Siddhartha's Intent, we've studied this a few times, actually. It's a really, really wonderful teaching. But in the commentary, then, Rabchen Rinpoche, he says, although we have done nothing to harm the ego, it has caused us continual harm since beginningless time. Ego clinging is unrelenting. We cannot befriend ego clinging, nor can we seduce, bribe, convince, nor establish fair terms with it. Unlike a normal enemy that needs to sleep, ego clinging attacks 24 hours a day. It will never give us any respite. Whereas we can protect ourselves from a normal enemy and keep a distance, ego clinging is at the very heart of our being, within our mind. Oddly enough, we have never turned it away. There are three ways to free yourself from the enemy of ego clinging. The first is to attack the notion of self and the afflicting mental states that it engenders. The second is to transform these destructive emotions through mindfulness and awareness. And the third is to look at the actual nature of these emotions and use them purposefully on the path. So this does correspond pretty much to the three ways in which we approach the, you could say, poison, or we approach the condition of the toxic notion of ego. And that is, first, to attack the notion of self in the afflicting mental states is to actually not give in to it, and also see how it doesn't exist, that it has no reality. So that's the basic approach, really, to see that we are suffering from a delusional condition. And that's where we then take this mind of ours and we transform it, which is what we do with the Lojong practice. So you could say the first is very much the Hinayana project of simply just establishing, you could say, selflessness of person, and understanding the toxicity of these mental states, which is, of course, what's basic then to working with the mind and eliminating aggression and attachment, etc., which is very much part of, you could say, the path of individual liberation. And then there's the greater Mahayana approach, which is then to transform our mind. Where our mind ordinarily works within thinking about me, then we are thinking about something that's greater. And that's where we presently also are engaging these practices of what we call mindfulness and awareness, both the actual discipline of mindful presence and also awareness in the sense of understanding what is needed in terms of the path. And so the Lojong and the Mahayana very much is about changing our entire outlook. The third is then referring more to the mantra path, or the Vajrayana, which is then embracing the purity of this. But very much this depends really on us having the vipassana that sees selflessness and sees the purity of ourself and all phenomena. And that's where, of course, everything is engaged on the path as being a display of purity. So that's the three ways in which this nature can be, or this situation of the ego can be approached. So just because I came across this, I found this very helpful. So then Dalai Lama really, and referring then to, as we have just seen here, this ego and the way that it actually brings us down. Again, it's so important not to fall into this sort of idea that I am bad or who I am is bad. That's not the point. But there's a delusion that rules us. There's you could say, a despot. There's a despot that has taken power within the kingdom of our mind, and it's a coward. It's a frivolous coup that has taken place, and really, it's really just a little bit like the Wizard of Oz. There's not really anybody there. It's just a little moment of actually our confusion and lack of presence, our mindlessness, which has allowed for this. And all we want to do is really just shine a light on it. But until then, for us to actually engage wholehearted in shining that light, we need to identify that this present situation is serious. This is very serious. As much as we get engaged in causes that are happening around the world with despots and tyrants and cruelty, then there's nowhere that even compares to the cruelty and destruction that's taking place within the delusion of our own mind, because that is where we are perpetuating our own suffering, and the suffering of others is perpetuated. So we cannot overestimate the harm really that this delusion causes. And this is why Shantideva is very explicit about this, the destructive and cruel nature of this ego. So His Holiness says then, to whom those whom we ordinarily consider to be our enemies can only be so for one lifetime at the most. But negative emotions have been harming us from time without beginning. They are truly the worst of enemies. So Shantideva says, all other foes that I appease and wait upon will show me favors, give me aid. But should I serve my dark defiled emotions, they will only harm me, draw me down to grief. And that's again also like Rabjamji was just saying, although we have done nothing to harm the ego, it has caused us continual harm since beginningless time. So ordinarily, if we make friends, make peace with our enemy, then this enemy will help us. But this is not the case with the ego. And again, this is where our confusion then is something that uniquely just draws us down. So His Holiness says there are always ways in which one can gradually make friends with an enemy. But the more we try to make friends with negative emotions, the stronger they become and the more they're able to harm us. If we think about it, as long as they continue to inhabit our mind, staying with us like close friends, we will never be happy. As long as anger, pride, and jealousy are in our minds, we'll always have external enemies. If we get rid of one enemy today, tomorrow another will appear. It is endless. While we may be able temporarily to free ourselves of enemies, with negative emotions entrenched in our minds, we shall never find lasting happiness. So again, this is where it's very important, again, we understand we're not talking about we are bad persons. And that's where we need to have the ability to distinguish between the confusion that happens when we tag along with our unconscious impulses and the clarity that is naturally what we are. And that's where it is so important for us to approach this really as practitioners. When we meditate, then it's very clear what it is that's happening, that we're fooled, we're deceived. So that's where we have this humble recognition that there is something inside us that is really just a delusional power. So, of course, if we don't meditate, then it sounds as if we're sort of almost in a sort of schizoid condition in which we're battling with two realities, and that's then where we would say, "Oh, this is this is so unkind to yourself." This is not what we're talking about. We are talking about being kind to ourselves. We're talking about very clear appreciation for ourselves, but it's also the appreciation for ourselves in which we have to have the dignity to cut off what really diminishes us. So that's where we are presently presenting this in terms of freeing ourselves from this enemy, understanding the need to seriously cut through this condition. Shantideva says, "This shall be my all-consuming passion. Filled with rancor, I will wage my war. Defilement of this kind will halt defilement. And for this reason, it shall not be spurned." So we're not just leaving this as sort of a nice little feel-good project when it's sort of the right moment and we have our practice, then we sit down, we become peaceful individuals. There's very much a commitment that extends beyond just the formal meditation, that really runs throughout our life in terms of an aspiration that lies at the core of our being, to not be in any way seduced by this deception. So this is, as Shantideva says then, "This shall be my all-consuming passion, filled with rancor, determination to no longer be deceived. I will wage my war." So His Holiness says, anyone who practices the Dharma has a duty to do battle with the enemy, negative emotions. If we wish to achieve ultimate happiness, we have to use this antidote to fight against this enemy. In doing so, we may encounter difficulties from time to time. But in an ordinary war, the trials and difficulties people go through are accepted and even encourage them to fight harder against the enemy. Moreover, in the ordinary world, a warrior's wounds are considered as signs of bravery, like medals. So as practicing Buddhists fighting with this real enemy, whose very nature is harm, we should expect difficulties and treat them as signs of victory. So when we see the repressed rise up and battle the oppressor, we usually go, yes, that's needed. There's this unjust tyranny that's taking place with immense cruelty, and we back the suppressed, the people who have been subject to cruelty unjustly, and we are sort of, yes, now we're finally, it's an uprising. And we have this in so much part of the dramas that we enjoy in our culture, where we then at the end then there's this sort of well, generally, there's the Hollywood ending where we then sort of have vanquished the one that perpetrated unjust suffering, and this is something that we truly rejoice in. So that's where there's everywhere a very clear understanding of how important and how heroic and how valuable this heroism is. And yes, it very often when we have some sort of scar from whatever we might get up to, battling mountain lions or whatever it might be, we come back with wounds, proud of our engagement with um, whatever. There's this pride. So this is also something that's quite ordinary in the world. And so likewise also we appreciate that in the journey and the practice of the path. Yes, it's destined, it's bound by a definition to be tough. His Holiness then says, an ordinary enemy may escape to a safe place, only to marshal his forces again and attack us once more. But once we have banished the negative emotions from our minds by using the true antidote, they have nowhere to hide and cannot return to harm us. So this is the good news about this here. We're not really, it's not really something that extends beyond our domain. We always know where to find this enemy. This is an enemy that can be ultimately vanquished. However, His Holiness says, we do not need anything as powerful as nuclear arms one might use to annihilate an ordinary enemy. For negative emotions are actually impotent, based as they are on ignorance, which itself has no strength. This inner enemy is easily vanquished with the weapons of discriminating wisdom, which knows the true nature of the emotions. And this discriminating wisdom, prajna, that is the intelligence that can distinguish between a paper tiger and a real tiger. It is the wisdom that sees that there is no snake, there is just a striped rope. So it's this prajna that does the work, and there's actually no effort involved. Nobody was harmed during this battle, except just as a condition of delusion. So it's really just not a question of being immensely strong or subjecting oneself to an incredibly tiresome, prolonged battle, but it's really just a question of looking, seeing. And that's where as much as we use the imagery here of battle, it is ultimately not about this kind of strength. And it is really about just looking, but also that looking requires us looking again and again. And due to the habitual patterns that we have been habituated to for such a long time, it requires that we look again and again. But it really just requires the sword or the weapon of prajna, which is not about battling an external enemy, but simply just cutting through deception. So Shantideva says, defilements are not in the object, nor within the faculties, nor somewhere in between. If not elsewhere, where is their abode? Whence they inflict their havoc on the world? They are simply mirages. So take heart. Banish all your fear and strive to know their nature. Why suffer needlessly the pains of hell? So again, this is referring to the way that we experience things, is that we have a perception of an object, and we also do this on the basis of the five senses. Then we do this on the basis of our faculties, such as the eye or the ear or the nose or the tactile perceptions, and also our thoughts. So it's not in the object, it's also not in these, you could say, faculties, and it's not somewhere else in between. We can find this, you could say, toxicity doesn't abide anywhere. The confusion, the experience of suffering and so on, it doesn't have any reality. And that's also the weapon that we're applying here is prajna. If we're going to wield a war against this enemy, we pick up our weapon, and it's prajna. And that's where the point of prajna is the recognition that there is, in fact, there is no such actual reality, neither in terms of the object or the subject. And that's why this entire situation in which we suffer is so unneeded. There's no need for us to go through all the various experiences of the realms of samsara. So His Holiness says, when we investigate carefully, we cannot find something, some powerful enemy called negative emotion. In reality, there is nothing there. For example, when we experience aversion or attachment, these emotions are not located in the ugly or beautiful objects that causes them, nor are they located in our own minds, nor are they to be found anywhere else. When we look more closely, we realize that it's through the coming together of causes and conditions that these emotions have such power. They do not have any power of their own. They are simply a nexus of factors that we identify and label. In fact, the emotions are entirely dependent on other things. The harm they do to us is due to illusion. If we really understand this, the negative emotions cannot harm us. So we cannot find anything in terms of the objects outside that we feel, I must have that, or I really dislike that, nor is it about our own minds. Also there, we cannot find anything flawed if we investigate. All what we have really is just a set of causes, a web of causes and conditions that we label as solid. But this solidity is entirely imaginary. So that's why the experiences that we have are just based on causes and conditions. And it's for us to actually look at this. All Shantideva wants us to do is just look, we're being fooled. But on the basis of being deceived, then we suffer. On the basis of looking, we can't be harmed by any of these negative emotions. Okay. See if there's any questions. Oh, there's one or two. Okay. Thank you for sending us information about the lung. Yeah. Yeah, the thing about lungs, yes, I think there's a general consensus that lungs are all right, because at the end, lungs online are valid, because even the way that lungs are being given in a sort of real life situation is on the basis of amplified technology, right? Analog systems or digital sort of, and so we already operate with the sound being transmitted through technology. So that's been a practice for a very long time. So So yes, that's okay. And really some of the sort of discussions, right, that's been taking place, right, presently around these issues are sort of more about empowerments, and also some people get quoted a little bit out of context, so misunderstandings can take place. But in fact, everybody's pretty much in agreement, I think. Luminosity. Can you please talk about it? As as this word is always a bit confusing to me. What is actually meant by it? Well, yes, that's a good question. You know, there's famously this quote from the Prajnaparamita where we say mind. There is no mind. The nature of mind is luminosity. So that with that we mean as far as our reality is concerned, we need to first identify mind as the creator of our entire reality, but also that has nothing that we can grasp about it. What is taking place is something that is luminous, and it is this luminosity that fails to understand itself that then constructs a sentient being. So you could say our very nature is luminosity, but in the absence of failing that, we have samsara. So the very quality that enables all the perceptions that we have, you could say our entire being is rich with a um, variety of subjective experience. But presently, this is diminished down into me and and then it becomes painful. And then, as much as there's all sorts of sort of experience going on in terms of happiness and joy, it's all the time just a sort of shadow, really, of the original nature, which is luminosity. And that's why we can see those who are free, they become incredibly creative and you could say artistic and compassionate and so on. So this nature that we possess is presently diminished through our confusion of self, and also our perception of the external world, which sort of permeated by the colors and textures, and what we in the Vajrayana would say, this is innately, intrinsically the expanse of the five mothers. And the entire realm of the phenomenal world also in our perception is diminished into the five elements, whereas it abides by that which is you could say that again, the expanse of the five mothers, or reality beyond what we can imagine. So all of this really comes from us diminishing ourselves. And it's on the basis of this, what His Holiness is talking about here, cutting through our confusion, that we're setting ourselves free, in which then the nature of reality is then luminosity. So there's always this, and this of course gets translated in so many ways, the clear light. And then of course in hippie jargon, you have this thing about, you know, when you die, go into the clear light and so on. There's sort of some rather sweet sort of ways of approaching this, which in some ways valid. And sometimes we do translate this in different ways. So it sounds like there's some sort of light out there and so on. But it's all valid. And, you know, last thing we want to do is kind of get bogged down on complaining about the vocabulary that translators use, but it's about our experience. And so luminosity is one word that we could use, and it really refers to the abiding condition of reality. So okay. When a negative emotion arises and I recognize it as negative, I find it has already created a sensation in my body and a disease in my mind. At that moment of recognition, how can I work with it and through it? Just the recognition gives me some relief, but that I'm finally seeing these kleshas, but I just remain aware. But do I just remain aware, or is there another way to undo the knot of neurosis? Well, yes. What is it we say? The body remembers and all of that. And we kind of have sometimes ways in our language in which we solidify that this happened and now I recognize it, but now it's affected me and so on. And that, of course, is true. We are affected in terms of our being, in terms of our psychosomatic construction. We have body, we have mind, and yes, it leaves imprint. But already that we're beginning to catch the tail of that tiger means that we're onto it. And of course, there are ways in which we can remedy this. We can work with the body. We can do what Feldenkrais therapy, or we can do with Kahuna massage, or we can do all sorts of things that sort of work from the secondary aspect, the result, and it sort of makes us feel better in terms of how we are. But there is really the need to get to the bottom, down to the bios of where it all originates, which is of course then the confused mind. So it's, as much as we work with the impact that circumstances have on us in terms of body and in terms of our energy, the real place that this takes place, the real location is this insecurity of self. And so we're onto it. And of course, as we're on the path, we're a mixed bag. We would say there's samsara, which is the confusion. There's enlightenment, which is non-confusion. But in between, there is the where we are right now is the condition of the path, in which the two, confusion and non-confusion, they're mixed, and we're gradually diluting the confusion, and gradually clarity is taking place. So the practice for us is just continually to come back to the presence. And that is, of course, where Shantideva says, I'm going to wage war. I'm going to win this one. I'm going to rise up against the oppressor. Yeah. Revolution is in the air. Vive la résistance. I can't see you this morning. Oh, that's no big loss. But the camera is switched on, by the way. So how do negative emotions imprint on our mind stream if they're fundamentally empty? Is this too a misperception? Well, yes, as long as we are we're ordinary beings, then we have this ground of our being that we call the alaya vijnana, or the ground storehouse consciousness, and that is where everything that we experience, it's layered there. So it's like when we've had experiences in life, they come up in our dreams. So that's where, as long as even though phenomena are empty when we look at them, the problem is we don't look at them. And that's why the Buddha says it is empty, but presently we're not really aware that it's empty. We think it's, very real. So that is where we need to understand they're empty, but we also need to understand that presently we are we're confused, and so we project solidity onto phenomena. So that's where you understand the Buddhist project. It doesn't really lie in just understanding how reality is. That's the beginning of it. It also lies in understanding how we're confused and fail to see reality. So we establish the view from the point of view of understanding how things are, but we need to take into account how we're failing to see that. Yeah. Catching constant habitual negative thoughts reminds me of the early day monks making piles of black rocks for negative and white for positive. Great visual reminder. Yeah, I mean, in the Tibetan tradition, yeah, they refer to this in terms of certain yogis of the past, but it's actually a legit practice that we could do ourselves. If we get some black and white rocks or whatever, some objects of different colors, we could very well do the same. So yeah. And it's good to have a lightness around this. We're on to something, and there's definitely a thief in the house, but we kind of have the upper hand. So that's where this exercise of just being aware is something that we'll catch. Yeah. Yeah, it's true. It could end up becoming quite an extensive project. Who are the five mothers? Oh, this is just a way that we refer to in the Vajrayana to the five elements: earth, water, fire, wind, and space. These are then understood as five mothers. In the Vajrayana, you very often have this image of the Yabyum Shiva Shakti, where cognizance is sort of the male and the expanse is the female. No matter how vigilant I am, yeah, things get past my radar. Some negative things still get past my radar. Oh, tell me about it. Welcome to the club. There's a there's a lot of us for whom the enemy flies under the radar, but we're not giving up. We're not giving up. Yeah. Um, Thank you for mentioning Feldenkrais work. Warmly recommended. Um, Regarding dream state and practice, should we be worried that although we are quite mindful and aware of our thoughts and emotions during the day, during sleep time, we have no way of separation from the fiction? How can we do that? Starting from where we can work, which is working with mindfulness awareness during the day. That will affect our dreams also. And in a way, the dreams are kind of indicative of how we're doing. So, but we should never be discouraged. It's just normal. We practice when we can. Also, of course, even within our day life, then we most of us don't have time to sit down with our white stones and black stones. We have a lot of other things that we need to do. So there's constantly conditions in which we just are without mindfulness. And of course, we find ourselves again and again caught up in patterns and afflictions, but we just go back to where we are. And when we recognize, then that's good. The enemy flies constantly during dream state. Yeah, yeah, it does. It does. But there's also, there's also how do you say, the side of the white is also there. The sort of the valiant forces of the good, they're also active. Okay. De nada. All right, thank you. Shall we then conclude here? And we shall meet again next week. May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen may it never fail, but grow and flourish ever more and more. Through all our births, wherever we may be born, may we be endowed with the 7 good qualities of the higher realms. As soon as we are born, may we meet with the Dharma and have the freedom to practice it properly. At that time, may we please the holy gurus and practice the Dharma throughout the day and night. Realizing the Dharma and accomplishing its essential meaning, may we cross the ocean of existence in that life. Thoroughly teaching the holy Dharma in this world, may we never tire of accomplishing the benefit of others. By this vast benefit of others, without partiality or bias, may all attain Buddhahood together.